The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B cast harsh shadows across the scarred wooden benches. And if you are watching this from your own corner of the world, whether that corner is a cozy living room in Ohio or a coffee shop in California, you might recognize the cold institutional feeling that seems to seep from these government buildings. Comment below and let me know where you are tuning in from, because this story of justice delayed but not denied could happen in any courthouse across the country. Maya Chin sat in the third row, her hands folded carefully over a worn leather purse that had seen better years. Her navy blue dress, clearly purchased from a discount retailer, hung loose on her small frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an elastic band that had definitely come from a drugstore multipack. She kept her eyes focused on the empty witness stand, refusing to turn around even when the heavy courtroom doors swung open with theatrical force. Derek Waverly made his entrance like a man accustomed to commanding attention. His charcoal gray suit probably cost more than Maya had spent on clothing in the past 2 years, and the Italian leather briefcase swinging at his side caught the overhead lighting with each confident step. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and when he smiled it revealed teeth that spoke of expensive orthodontics and regular dental care. He moved with the easy swagger of someone who had never doubted that the world would bend to accommodate his desires. Behind Derek came his attorney, Margaret Steinberg, a woman whose reputation preceded her like expensive perfume. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her black power suit fit her tall frame with the precision that only came from custom tailoring. She carried herself with the predatory grace of someone who had never lost a custody case that mattered, and the way she surveyed the courtroom suggested she considered this particular hearing to be little more than a formality. Maya's public defender, Thomas Nakamura, sat hunched over a stack of manila folders that threatened to spill their contents across the defense table. His brown suit showed wrinkles from too many late nights spent preparing for cases he could not possibly win, and his wire-rimmed glasses kept sliding down his nose as he frantically shuffled through papers that seemed to multiply when he was not looking. He had the haggard appearance of someone fighting an endless war against a system designed to overwhelm him. Judge Patricia Holloway entered with the measured steps of someone who had presided over thousands of these family disputes, each one a small tragedy wrapped in legal procedure. Her black robes rustled softly as she settled behind the bench, and her gray eyes swept the courtroom with practiced efficiency. She had learned long ago not to make assumptions based on appearances, but the stark contrast between the two legal teams made it difficult to imagine this would be anything other than a swift victory for the better-funded side. The custody hearing began with Derek's attorney standing to address the court, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. She explained that her client Derek Waverly was seeking primary custody of his twin daughters, 8-year-old Sophie and Emma, currently living with their mother Maya Chun in what could only be described as severely reduced circumstances. Margaret gestured toward Derek with obvious pride as she detailed his recent business successes. He was the founder and chief executive of WaveTech Solutions, a technology startup that had recently completed a successful initial public offering. His personal net worth now exceeded 7 figures, and he lived in a 5,000-square-foot home in the prestigious Northwood Hills subdivision. He could provide his daughters with private school educations, music lessons, summer camps, and every advantage that money could buy. Maya, on the other hand, lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better decades. She worked part-time at a coffee shop and part-time cleaning offices, earning barely enough to keep herself fed, let alone provide for growing children. The contrast could not be starker, and Margaret's tone suggested that continuing the current arrangement would border on child neglect. Derek took the witness stand with the confidence of someone testifying at his own coronation. He spoke about his love for his daughters, his stable income, his ability to provide them with opportunities their mothers simply could not match. When asked about child support, he leaned back in the witness chair and smiled magnanimously. "I think $200 a month would be generous," Derek said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Given that Maya has never really contributed financially to anything, I believe this would actually exceed what would be fair based on her historical involvement in our family finances." Maya's attorney began to object, but Derek was already continuing, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his subject. During our marriage, Maya spent most of her time on what she called computer projects, but they never produced any real income. She seemed to think that playing around online was the same as having an actual job. I tried to encourage her to pursue more practical skills, but she preferred her fantasy world of technology. The casual cruelty in Derek's tone was unmistakable, and several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He spoke about Maya as though she were a particularly disappointing employee rather than the mother of his children, and his expression suggested he found her presence in the courtroom to be something of an inconvenience. Maya remained perfectly still throughout Derek's testimony, her hands folded in her lap and her expression unreadable. Occasionally, she would lean over to whisper something to her overwhelmed attorney, who would nod frantically and scribble notes on a yellow legal pad. Most observers assumed she was simply trying to help her lawyer understand the details of their financial situation, but there was something oddly specific about the way she spoke, and the way Thomas suddenly became more focused when she did. Derek continued his performance on the witness stand, describing how he had tried to teach Maya about real financial responsibility during their marriage, but she had consistently shown poor judgment when it came to money. He mentioned her tendency to spend small amounts on what he called internet nonsense, investments in things that did not exist and would never have any value. She wanted to waste money on computer money, Derek explained with an indulgent chuckle. Bitcoin or something like that. I had to put my foot down because she would have squandered our grocery money on complete fantasy. Even now, I doubt she understands the difference between real investments and whatever scams she found online. Judge Holloway listened to Derek's testimony with the neutral expression she had cultivated over decades of family court proceedings, but even she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the patronizing tone he adopted when discussing his ex-wife. Maya continued taking notes on an old tablet computer, occasionally tapping the screen with movements that seemed surprisingly sophisticated for someone Derek had described as technologically naive. When Derek finally stepped down from the witness stand, he returned to his seat with obvious satisfaction, adjusting his expensive tie and sharing a confident look with his attorney. The hearing would continue, but he clearly believed the outcome was already decided. Maya Chun would receive her modest monthly stipend. He would gain primary custody of his daughters, and life would continue according to the natural order where success was rewarded and failure was marginalized. Maya looked up from her tablet for the first time since Derek had begun testifying, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her dark eyes that suggested she might have her own ideas about how this hearing would conclude. Margaret Steinberg rose from her seat with the fluid grace of a predator who had caught the scent of wounded prey. She approached the witness stand where Derek still sat, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly challenged in any arena that mattered to him. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of expensive education and decades of courtroom victories. "I would like to present a more detailed picture of the financial realities that will determine what is truly in the best interests of Sophie and Emma Waverly. My client has built something extraordinary from nothing, while the children's mother has consistently demonstrated a fundamental inability to understand even the most basic principles of financial responsibility." Derek straightened in the witness chair, clearly relishing the opportunity to elaborate on his success story. Margaret guided him through his testimony with the precision of a conductor leading a familiar symphony, each question designed to highlight another aspect of his triumph while simultaneously emphasizing Maya's failures. "Mr. Waverly," Margaret said, "please tell the court about the founding of WaveTech Solutions and how your business acumen has created the stable foundation that your daughters deserve." Derek's chest swelled with visible pride as he launched into his narrative. WaveTech Solutions began as my vision for revolutionizing small business data management, he explained, his voice gaining momentum as he spoke. "I identified a gap in the market where traditional software solutions were failing to meet the needs of growing companies. Through strategic planning, careful investment, and genuine business expertise, I was able to develop a platform that now serves over 3,000 clients across North America." He paused to let the impressive numbers sink in before continuing. "Our initial public offering 3 months ago raised $47 million in capital. My personal stake in the company is now valued at approximately $8.2 million, and that represents only a portion of my diversified investment portfolio. Maya's attorney Thomas made a half-hearted attempt to object to the relevance of these specific financial details, but Judge Holloway allowed Derek to continue. Margaret had clearly rehearsed this portion of the testimony extensively, and Derek delivered each achievement like he was reading from a resume designed to impress the gods themselves. The contrast with Maya's situation could not have been more stark, and Derek seemed to take genuine pleasure in drawing attention to the disparity. During our marriage, Derek continued, Maya showed no interest in learning about real business or developing practical skills that could contribute to our family's financial security. Instead, she spent countless hours on what she called computer projects that never produced anything of value. His tone shifted subtly as he spoke about his ex-wife, adopting the patient condescension of someone explaining simple concepts to a particularly slow child. Maya seemed to believe that sitting at a computer screen constituted actual work, but when I asked her to show me tangible results or measurable income from these activities, she could never provide any real answers. She would get defensive and claim I did not understand her projects, but the truth was that there were no real projects to understand. Derek's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his subject, and Maya could see several spectators nodding along with his assessment. He painted a picture of himself as the patient husband trying to guide his wife toward practical productivity while she stubbornly pursued fantasies that would never benefit their family. I tried to encourage Maya to consider pursuing education in areas that might actually lead to employment, Derek said, his tone suggesting he deserved credit for his generous patience. I offered to pay for business courses or certification programs that could help her contribute meaningfully to our household income. Instead, she insisted on wasting time with various internet schemes that she claimed would eventually pay off. Margaret prompted him to elaborate on Maya's financial decision-making, and Derek's expression shifted to one of barely concealed frustration mixed with superiority. She developed an obsession with something called Bitcoin, Derek explained, practically spitting out the word like it tasted unpleasant. This was some kind of internet money that existed only on computers, completely intangible and utterly worthless. Maya wanted to spend our real money buying these imaginary coins, and I had to repeatedly explain to her why this was financially irresponsible. The dismissive way Derek pronounced Bitcoin suggested he considered it to be roughly equivalent to monopoly money, and his obvious disdain for Maya's interest in cryptocurrency drew knowing looks from several spectators who shared his skepticism about digital assets. She would beg me to let her spend $50 or $100 on more Bitcoin, Derek continued, his voice rising slightly as he recalled these disagreements. I had to be the responsible adult and explain that we needed real money for real expenses like mortgage payments and groceries. Maya never seemed to understand that fantasy investments cannot pay for actual bills. Thomas Nakamura shifted uncomfortably in his seat and glanced at Maya, who continued taking notes on her tablet with the same focused concentration she had maintained throughout Derek's testimony. Occasionally, she would lean over to whisper something to her attorney, and Thomas would nod and scribble additional notes on his increasingly chaotic legal pad. Derek's testimony grew more animated as Margaret guided him through specific examples of Maya's supposed financial irresponsibility. She once tried to convince me to take out a second mortgage on our house so she could buy more of this internet money, Derek said, his voice heavy with the martyred patience of someone who had endured unreasonable demands. When I explained that risking our family's home for computer fantasies was completely unacceptable, she accused me of not supporting her dreams. But I had to protect our daughter's future from their mother's poor judgment. Judge Holloway listened to Derek's testimony with the neutral expression that family court judges perfected over years of hearing similar disputes. But even she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the vindictive pleasure Derek took in cataloging his ex-wife's supposed shortcomings. Margaret then presented evidence of Derek's current financial status, including bank statements showing healthy account balances, investment portfolios demonstrating sophisticated financial planning, and documentation of the substantial trust funds he had already established for his daughter's education. The contrast with Maya's situation was devastating and deliberate. Your Honor, Derek said as his testimony neared its climax, I am requesting full custody of Sophie and Emma because their mother simply cannot provide them with the stability and opportunities they deserve. Maya lives in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that is not safe for children. She works two part-time jobs that barely cover her own basic expenses, let alone the costs of raising two growing girls. He leaned forward in the witness chair, adopting a tone of concerned paternity that felt rehearsed but effective. My daughters need structure, educational opportunities, and financial security. They need music lessons and soccer teams and summer camps and college funds. Maya cannot provide any of these things because she never learned to distinguish between financial fantasy and economic reality. Derek's final attack was delivered with surgical precision. Even now, Your Honor, I believe Maya continues to harbor delusions about internet money and other schemes that will supposedly make her wealthy. This kind of magical thinking is not appropriate for someone responsible for children's welfare. My daughters need a parent who understands how the real world actually works. Maya looked up from her tablet as Derek finished his testimony, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the courtroom. Derek's expression was one of satisfied triumph, the look of someone who had just delivered what he considered to be a knockout punch. Maya's expression remained unreadable, but she tilted her head slightly and made one final note on her tablet before whispering something to Thomas that caused the overwhelmed public defender to suddenly sit up straighter and flip through his papers with renewed purpose. Derek stepped down from the witness stand with obvious satisfaction, adjusting his expensive watch and sharing a confident smile with Margaret Steinberg. He had painted a picture of himself as the responsible provider and Maya as the delusional dreamer, and the evidence seemed to support his version of events so completely that the hearing's outcome appeared to be a foregone conclusion. But as Derek returned to his seat, Maya was still taking notes, her fingers moving across her tablet screen with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she might know more about technology than her ex-husband had given her credit for. Thomas Nakamura stood slowly from the defense table, and something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor since Maya's whispered consultation. The frantic shuffling of papers had stopped, replaced by deliberate movements as he organized a specific set of documents that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. His wire-rimmed glasses no longer slipped down his nose, and when he approached the bench, his voice carried an authority that had been completely absent during Derek's testimony. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his tone suddenly crisp and professional, "I would like to present a comprehensive financial history that will provide this court with a complete picture of both parties' economic circumstances throughout their marriage and subsequent separation. The defense requests permission to introduce evidence regarding Mrs. Chin's complete financial activities from 2013 to present." Margaret Steinberg's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a slight frown as she sensed something shifting in the courtroom's atmosphere. She had expected Maya's public defender to offer token resistance before accepting the inevitable defeat, but Thomas was speaking with the confidence of someone holding a winning hand rather than begging for mercy. Derek shifted slightly in his seat, his previous expression of satisfied triumph flickering as he tried to understand why Maya's attorney was suddenly acting like he had something important to say. The transformation was so dramatic that it seemed almost like a different person had taken Thomas's place, someone who knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going with his line of questioning. Judge Holloway nodded for Thomas to proceed, and he turned toward Maya with a respectful gesture that invited her to approach the witness stand. Maya arose from her seat with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout Derek's devastating testimony. But there was something different about her movement now, a sense of purpose that had been hidden beneath her earlier apparent resignation. As Maya settled into the witness chair, Thomas returned to the defense table and retrieved a slim tablet computer that looked considerably more sophisticated than the aging device Maya had been using to take notes. He also gathered a neat stack of papers that appeared to have been organized with military precision, each document separated by colored tabs that suggested systematic preparation rather than desperate improvisation. "Mrs. Chun," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I would like to walk through your financial activities during your marriage to Mr. Waverly, beginning with some transactions that occurred in late 2013. Do you recall making any investments or purchases during that time period that your husband might have characterized as computer-related?" Maya nodded calmly, her hands folded in her lap as she spoke. "Yes, in November of 2013, I began purchasing Bitcoin using money I had saved from birthday gifts and small amounts I earned doing freelance computer repair work for neighbors and friends. Derek's confident expression wavered slightly at Maya's mention of freelance work, and he leaned forward to whisper something urgent to Margaret. His attorney's frown deepened as she tried to understand why this seemingly irrelevant ancient history was being introduced, but she made no immediate objection. Thomas approached the witness stand carrying his tablet, which he connected to the courtroom's projection system with practiced efficiency. The large screen that had been blank throughout Derek's testimony suddenly displayed what appeared to be a simple spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and transaction numbers that meant nothing to most observers. Mrs. Chun, Thomas continued, can you explain to the court what these records represent and why they are relevant to this custody proceeding? Maya's voice remained steady and clear as she began to explain. These are blockchain transaction records showing my Bitcoin purchases between November 2013 and August 2015. Each entry represents a purchase I made using personal money that I earned independently or received as gifts from my family. Derek's face had gone slightly pale, and he was whispering more urgently to Margaret, who was shaking her head and trying to wave him quiet. Judge Holloway noticed the disturbance at the plaintiff's table and gave them a sharp look that reminded them they were in her courtroom. The spreadsheet on the projection screen showed dozens of small transactions, most ranging from $20 to $50, with purchase dates that spanned nearly 2 years. To casual observers, it looked like nothing more than a record of minor hobby expenses, but Derek's increasingly agitated behavior suggested these numbers meant something more significant than they appeared. Thomas guided Maya through the testimony with methodical precision, asking her to explain specific transactions that Derek had apparently forgotten or chosen not to mention during his own testimony. Maya described how she had initially purchased Bitcoin at prices around $200 per coin, using money she earned from part-time computer repair work that Derek had dismissed as meaningless tinkering. Mr. Waverly testified that you spent time on worthless computer projects, Thomas said, his tone suggesting this characterization might not be entirely accurate. Can you describe the nature of this work and the income it generated? Maya's response was delivered with quiet dignity. I provided technical support and computer repair services for small businesses and individual clients in our neighborhood. The work generated between $300 and $800 per month, which I used for personal expenses and my Bitcoin investments. Derek was aware of this income, but considered it insignificant compared to his salary. Margaret finally stood to object, her voice carrying a note of irritation as she tried to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, these financial details from nearly a decade ago have no bearing on the current custody determination. Mrs. Chin's small-scale hobby investments are irrelevant to her present ability to provide for the children. But Judge Holloway seemed intrigued by the systematic way Thomas was presenting the evidence, and she allowed the testimony to continue. Derek's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as Maya described transaction after transaction, his whispered consultations with Margaret growing more desperate with each new revelation. Thomas then displayed a series of email printouts that showed correspondence between Maya and various Bitcoin exchanges, demonstrating a level of technical sophistication that directly contradicted Derek's portrayal of her as technologically naive. The emails revealed that Maya had been methodically researching cryptocurrency markets and developing investment strategies, while Derek dismissed her activities as meaningless computer games. Mrs. Chun, Thomas said, pointing to one particular email thread, can you explain this correspondence with Coinbase regarding wallet security and long-term storage solutions? This appears to be quite technical for someone who Mr. Waverly described as having poor judgment about technology investments. Maya's explanation revealed depths of knowledge that shocked everyone except Thomas, who seemed to have expected exactly this level of expertise. She described how she had implemented advanced security measures to protect her Bitcoin holdings, including multi-signature wallets and cold storage solutions that required significant technical understanding to execute properly. Derek was now visibly sweating despite the courtroom's air conditioning, and his expensive suit seemed to be constricting around his collar as he realized that Maya's supposedly worthless computer hobby had involved far more sophisticated planning than he had ever imagined. Margaret was frantically taking notes and requesting brief recesses that Judge Holloway denied. The timeline of Maya's Bitcoin purchases painted a picture of consistent, methodical investment over a period when Derek had actively discouraged her from learning about financial markets. Every transaction was documented with meticulous precision, and Maya's testimony revealed that she had continued purchasing Bitcoin even after Derek had explicitly forbidden her from wasting money on internet currency. Thomas then introduced a series of bank statements that showed Maya had been careful to use only her personal earnings for cryptocurrency purchases, never touching joint accounts or family money despite Derek's later claims that she had threatened their financial security. The evidence demonstrated a level of financial responsibility that directly contradicted every accusation Derek had made about her money management skills. Mrs. Chun, Thomas said, approaching the climax of this portion of his presentation, Mr. Waverly testified that your interest in Bitcoin represented poor judgment and magical thinking. Based on the evidence we have reviewed, how would you characterize your investment strategy during this period? Maya's response was delivered with quiet confidence that seemed to fill the courtroom. I was implementing a dollar-cost averaging strategy based on my research into emerging financial technologies. I believe that blockchain-based currencies represented a significant technological advancement with long-term growth potential, and I allocated a small percentage of my personal income toward building a position in what I considered to be an undervalued asset class. The technical sophistication of Maya's answer struck the courtroom like a thunderbolt. This was not the financially naive woman Derek had described, but someone who clearly understood investment principles and market analysis at a level that exceeded most casual investors. Derek suddenly stood from his seat, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice cracking slightly, "this is completely irrelevant ancient history. Maya bought a few dollars worth of internet money that probably disappeared years ago. None of this has any bearing on her current ability to support our daughters." Judge Holloway's sharp rebuke cut through Derek's outburst. "Mr. Waverly, you will remain seated and allow your attorney to make any necessary objections. This court will determine what evidence is relevant to these proceedings." Thomas smiled slightly as he returned to his tablet, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice carrying a hint of anticipation that sent a chill through Derek's already compromised composure, "I would like to present your complete digital asset portfolio as it exists today. Do I have your permission to access your current wallet balances and display them for the court?" Maya nodded calmly, her dark eyes meeting Derek's panicked gaze across the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "I formally request that my complete cryptocurrency holdings be entered into evidence as part of these custody proceedings." Derek's expensive Italian leather briefcase slipped from his trembling hands and hit the courtroom floor with a sound like a judge's gavel, and Margaret Steinberg's perfectly composed expression cracked for the first time in her distinguished legal career. Thomas Nakamura moved toward the courtroom's projection system with the deliberate precision of someone about to detonate a carefully placed explosive device. His tablet connected to the large screen with a soft electronic chime that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room like a funeral bell. Derek's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and beads of perspiration were forming along his hairline despite the courtroom's efficient air conditioning. "Mrs. Chun," Thomas said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had been building toward this moment throughout the entire proceeding, "please provide your primary Bitcoin wallet address so we can display your current holdings for the court." Maya reached into her purse and withdrew a small piece of paper that looked like it had been carefully folded and stored for years. She unfolded it with steady hands and read aloud a long string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to most people in the courtroom, but caused Derek to make a choking sound that drew sharp looks from several spectators. The projection screen flickered for a moment before displaying the clean interface of a blockchain Explorer website. Thomas entered Maya's wallet address with practiced efficiency, and the page loaded to reveal information that transformed the atmosphere in courtroom 4B like someone had suddenly changed the air pressure. At the top of the screen, displayed in bold numbers that seemed to pulse with their own electronic heartbeat, was Maya's Bitcoin balance. The figure read 2,847.3894 BTC, and below that, in slightly smaller but equally devastating text, Was the current US dollar value calculated in real time based on market prices? $120,347,812. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that the faint humming of the courtroom's ventilation system sounded like a jet engine. Judge Holloway's reading glasses slipped down her nose as she stared at the screen, her decades of courtroom experience providing no reference point for processing what she was seeing. Several spectators audibly gasped, and one woman in the back row dropped her purse with a sound that startled everyone. Derek's face had gone from pale to completely white, the color draining from his features like water flowing out of a broken dam. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he stared at the screen, and his hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned bone white. Margaret Steinberg sat frozen beside him, her expensive pen hovering motionless over her legal pad as she tried to process numbers that had just rendered her entire case strategy obsolete. Thomas allowed the shock to settle for several long moments before continuing his methodical presentation. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "can you explain to the court how you accumulated this substantial digital asset portfolio?" Maya's response was delivered with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the hearing, but now her calm demeanor seemed less like resignation and more like the confidence of someone who had always known exactly how this story would end. "I began purchasing Bitcoin in November of 2013 when the price was approximately $200 per coin," she explained, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "My initial investment was $25, which allowed me to purchase 0.125 Bitcoin. She gestured toward the screen where transaction histories were now scrolling past in chronological order, each entry representing another small purchase that Derek had dismissed as meaningless waste. "Over the following 2 years, I continued purchasing small amounts whenever I had extra income from my computer repair work or received money as gifts from family members. My average cost per Bitcoin was approximately $450. Thomas guided Maya through the timeline of her investments with surgical precision, displaying transaction after transaction that revealed a level of consistency and discipline that spoke to sophisticated long-term planning rather than impulsive gambling. Each purchase had been carefully documented, and Maya's records showed that she had continued investing even when Bitcoin prices fluctuated dramatically, demonstrating the kind of market discipline that professional investors spent years learning to develop. Derek finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. "Those wallet addresses," he said, his words barely audible across the courtroom. "I remember those numbers. You showed them to me during our marriage, and I told you they were worthless." Maya nodded calmly, her dark eyes meeting Derek's panicked gaze without flinching. "You told me that Bitcoin was imaginary money that would disappear when people came to their senses," she said, her voice carrying no trace of vindictiveness despite the devastating accuracy of her memory. "You said I was wasting money on computer fantasies and that I needed to focus on real investments like your technology company stock options." Thomas then displayed a series of email exchanges between Maya and Derek from 2014 and 2015, conversations where Derek had repeatedly dismissed Maya's cryptocurrency holdings as worthless speculation while boasting about his own business acumen. The emails revealed a pattern of condescending lectures where Derek explained to Maya why her investments were doomed to fail while his own ventures represented sound financial planning. In one particularly damaging exchange from March 2014, Derek had written that Maya's Bitcoin purchases were proof of her fundamental inability to understand economics, and that he was embarrassed to have a wife who fell for obvious internet scams. Maya's responses in these emails had been respectful and deferential, but they also included detailed explanations of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency market dynamics that demonstrated knowledge far exceeding Derek's casual dismissals. "Mrs. Chun," Thomas continued, "Mr. Waverly testified that you threatened your family's financial security by wanting to invest grocery money in digital currencies. Can you clarify the source of funds you used for these investments?" Maya's explanation revealed another layer of Derek's deception and control. "Every dollar I invested came from my personal earnings or gifts," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Derek had access to all joint accounts and monitored every transaction. I was forced to hide my Bitcoin purchases because he had explicitly forbidden me from making what he called wasteful investments, even with my own money. Thomas displayed bank records that showed Maya had maintained a separate account funded solely by her freelance computer work, money that Derek had dismissed as insignificant but had still attempted to control. The records revealed that Maya had been systematically denied access to joint investment accounts, while Derek made unilateral decisions about their family's financial future. Judge Holloway finally broke her stunned silence, her voice carrying the careful authority of someone trying to process information that challenged every assumption she had made about this case. "Mrs. Chun," she said, leaning forward slightly, "are you saying that your current net worth is approximately $120 million? Maya nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor. Based on current Bitcoin market prices, my digital asset portfolio is valued at just over $120 million. I also maintain smaller holdings in Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies that would bring the total value to approximately $125 million. Derek suddenly exploded from his seat, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering under the weight of what he was hearing. "This is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation and disbelief. Maya could never have accumulated that kind of money. She was living in a one-bedroom apartment working at a coffee shop. Where would she get millions of dollars? Judge Holloway's sharp rebuke cut through Derek's outburst like a blade. "Mr. Waverly, you will control yourself in my courtroom, or I will have you removed. Your attorney may address any concerns through proper legal channels." But Derek was beyond hearing judicial warnings, his mind racing as he tried to understand how the woman he had dismissed as financially incompetent had somehow become wealthier than he could ever hope to be. Margaret was pulling frantically at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down before he did further damage to their already destroyed case. Thomas continued his presentation with methodical thoroughness, displaying additional evidence that revealed the full scope of Maya's hidden financial sophistication. She had not only accumulated massive Bitcoin holdings, but had also implemented advanced security measures and tax planning strategies that demonstrated professional-level expertise in cryptocurrency management. The irony was devastating and complete. Derek had spent years mocking Maya's interest in digital currencies, while building his own wealth through traditional technology investments that now seemed almost quaint by comparison. His $7 million net worth, which had seemed so impressive just minutes earlier, was now revealed to be less than 6% of what Maya had quietly accumulated while he dismissed her activities as worthless computer games. "Mrs. Chun," Thomas said, approaching the climax of his revelation, "Mr. Waverly has requested $200 monthly in child support based on his assessment of your financial capabilities. Given your actual net worth, how would you propose to address the financial needs of your daughters?" Maya's response was delivered with quiet dignity that made Derek's earlier arrogance seem even more pathetic by comparison. "I would be happy to establish trust funds of $50,000 per month for each of my daughters," she said, her words falling on the courtroom like gentle hammer blows. "This would ensure they have access to the finest educational opportunities, healthcare, and any activities or experiences that might enrich their lives." Derek's legs gave out, and he collapsed back into his chair, the mathematical reality crushing him like physical weight. Maya was offering to spend more money each month on their daughters than he earned in an entire year from his supposedly successful technology company. Judge Holloway stared at the projection screen where Maya's Bitcoin holdings continued to display their staggering value, the numbers updating in real time as global markets fluctuated. This was no longer a simple custody dispute between a successful businessman and his financially struggling ex-wife. This had become something unprecedented in her decades of family court experience, a complete reversal of every assumption that had guided the morning's proceedings. Margaret Steinberg finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a professional whisper. "Your Honor," she said, her usual commanding presence reduced to desperate damage control, "we request a brief recess to consult with our client about these unexpected developments." But Derek was already standing again, his face flushed with desperate anger and the terrible realization that everything he thought he knew about his ex-wife had been catastrophically wrong. "Those Bitcoin holdings should be considered marital property," he declared, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. Maya acquired them during our marriage using resources that should have been shared. I deserve half of everything she accumulated while we were legally joined. Maya looked at Derek with an expression of gentle pity that was somehow more devastating than any show of anger could have been. The Bitcoin I purchased with my own earnings, using money you explicitly told me I was forbidden to invest, she said quietly. Money you claimed was too insignificant to matter, from work you dismissed as meaningless computer games. Thomas nodded toward his client before addressing Derek directly. Mr. Waverly, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful preparation had just paid off spectacularly. Your testimony this morning included multiple statements dismissing Mrs. Chin's cryptocurrency investments as worthless fantasies. You cannot now claim ownership of assets you spent years insisting had no value. Derek stood in the middle of courtroom 4B, surrounded by the wreckage of his assumptions and facing the mathematical impossibility of his situation. The woman he had dismissed as financially incompetent had just been revealed as one of the wealthiest people he would ever meet, and his own arrogance had provided the evidence that would ensure he could never claim any portion of her fortune. The projection screen continued displaying Maya's Bitcoin holdings in all their devastating glory, the numbers serving as a digital monument to the dangers of underestimating someone based on superficial appearances and prejudicial assumptions. Thomas Nakamura moved to his organized stack of documents with the methodical precision of someone conducting a demolition, each piece of evidence carefully selected to dismantle what remained of Derek's position. Derek sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of someone watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had replaced his earlier nervous fumbling. I would like to present additional evidence that will clarify Mr. Waverly's role in limiting Mrs. Chin's investment activities during their marriage. These documents will demonstrate that Mrs. Chin's cryptocurrency portfolio would likely be significantly larger if not for her ex-husband's controlling financial behavior. Margaret Steinberg attempted one final objection, her voice lacking its earlier commanding presence. Your Honor, these historical marital disputes have no bearing on current custody arrangements and seem designed only to embarrass my client rather than serve the children's best interests. Judge Holloway, still processing the staggering revelation of Maya's wealth, allowed Thomas to continue. The court is interested in understanding the complete financial picture, especially given the dramatic discrepancies between Mr. Waverly's testimony and the evidence now before us. Thomas displayed a series of bank records on the projection screen that revealed a pattern of financial control that contradicted Derek's earlier portrayal of himself as a supportive husband trying to guide Maya toward fiscal responsibility. The documents showed that Derek had systematically limited Maya's access to joint accounts and required his approval for any expenditure above $50. Mrs. Chun, Thomas said, turning toward Maya, who remained composed despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Can you explain to the court how Mr. Waverly's financial restrictions affected your ability to invest in cryptocurrency during your marriage? Maya's response was delivered with quiet dignity that made Derek's earlier condescension seem even more pathetic in retrospect. Derek maintained complete control over our joint checking and savings accounts, she explained. I was required to ask his permission for any purchase beyond basic groceries and household necessities. When I expressed interest in investing larger amounts in Bitcoin, he would refuse and lecture me about wasting money on internet fantasies. Thomas then displayed email exchanges that showed Derek had threatened divorce if Maya continued what he called her obsession with worthless digital currency. In one particularly damaging message from April 2014, Derek had written that if Maya spent $1 more on Bitcoin, he would consider it grounds for ending their marriage and seeking full custody of their daughters. The emails revealed the extent of Derek's financial abuse, showing how he had used threats of divorce and custody loss to control Maya's investment decisions while simultaneously dismissing her technical knowledge and business instincts. Maya's responses demonstrated remarkable restraint and deference despite being denied basic financial autonomy. Mr. Waverly, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, Your testimony this morning characterized Mrs. Chun as financially irresponsible for wanting to invest in cryptocurrency. These bank records show that you prevented her from making larger investments that would now be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. How do you reconcile this contradiction? Derek's response emerged as a strangled whisper, his face flushed with the terrible realization of his massive miscalculation. I was protecting our family's financial security, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. Nobody could have predicted that internet money would become valuable. I was being responsible. Thomas nodded gravely before delivering his next devastating revelation. Mrs. Chun, based on your investment timeline and the amounts you wanted to purchase but were prevented from buying, can you estimate what your cryptocurrency portfolio might be worth today if Mr. Waverly had not restricted your access to joint funds? Maya's calculation was delivered with mathematical precision that silenced the entire courtroom. If Derek had allowed me to invest the amounts I requested, primarily the $5,000 I wanted to allocate monthly starting in early 2014, my current Bitcoin holdings would be worth approximately $450 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, and Derek made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh cut short by horror. Margaret sat frozen beside him, her legal expertise providing no framework for addressing a situation where her client had prevented his wife from becoming nearly $500 million wealthy. Thomas continued his methodical destruction of Derek's case by revealing how Maya's forced financial secrecy had actually demonstrated remarkable business acumen. Despite being limited to small investments made with her personal earnings, Maya had consistently purchased Bitcoin during market downturns and held her positions through dramatic price volatility, strategies that required sophisticated understanding of investment psychology. Your Honor, Maya said, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from holding an unassailable position, I would like to address Mr. Waverly's request for marital property claims regarding my cryptocurrency holdings. During our marriage, Derek repeatedly stated that Bitcoin had no value and would disappear when people realized it was a scam. He cannot now claim ownership of assets he spent years insisting were worthless. Derek desperately attempted one final gambit, his voice rising with panic as he realized the mathematical impossibility of his situation. Your Honor, my technology background and business connections contributed to Maya's understanding of cryptocurrency markets. Without my influence, she never would have been exposed to these investment opportunities. Maya's response demolished Derek's claim with quiet precision. Derek's technology company focuses on traditional database management software, she explained. His business has no connection to blockchain technology or cryptocurrency markets. In fact, Derek consistently dismissed my explanations of how digital currencies functioned and refused to allow me to attend Bitcoin conferences or educational events. Thomas then revealed Maya's final devastating secret. Mrs. Chun, he said, can you tell the court about your current relationship with WaveTech Solutions, Mr. Waverly's technology company? Maya's answer sent Derek's remaining hopes crashing into complete ruin. In 2019, WaveTech Solutions hired me as a blockchain consultant to help them understand cryptocurrency integration for their client base, she said calmly. They paid my consulting firm $2.4 million over 18 months for services that Derek's company could not provide internally. Derek's face went completely white as he realized that his own business success had been partially funded by the wealth of the woman he was now trying to claim had no financial understanding. His technology company had literally paid Maya millions of dollars for expertise he had dismissed as worthless computer games during their marriage. Margaret finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a professional whisper. Your Honor, she said, her usual commanding presence reduced to damage control mode. Given these unexpected revelations about financial circumstances, we would like to request a recess to discuss modified custody and support arrangements with our client. Maya looked directly at Derek for the first time since the hearing began, her expression carrying no vindictiveness despite the years of dismissal and financial control she had endured. Derek, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, I will establish trust funds of $50,000 per month for Sophie and Emma. I will pay for their private education, healthcare, activities, and anything else they might need or want. You are welcome to remain involved in their lives, but you will no longer make decisions about their financial security. Derek sat in stunned silence as the complete reversal of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The woman he had dismissed as financially incompetent was now offering him more money each month than his successful technology company generated in quarterly profits. His custody case had transformed from a certain victory into a humiliating defeat that would be documented in public records for anyone to research. Judge Holloway stared at Maya with something approaching awe, her decades of family court experience providing no reference point for processing a case where the apparently powerless party had just been revealed as holding wealth that exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations. The projection screen continued displaying Maya's Bitcoin holdings, the numbers serving as an electronic monument to the catastrophic consequences of underestimating someone based on superficial appearances and prejudicial assumptions about their capabilities. Judge Holloway removed her reading glasses and set them carefully on the bench before her, the weight of what she had witnessed requiring a moment of careful consideration before rendering her decision. The courtroom remained in stunned silence, the only sound coming from Derek's labored breathing as he sat slumped in his chair, staring at the projection screen that continued to display Maya's cryptocurrency holdings like an electronic monument to his catastrophic miscalculations. Based on the evidence presented today, Judge Holloway began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had presided over thousands of family disputes, but never anything quite like this. The court finds that the children's best interests would be served by awarding primary physical custody to Mrs. Chun. Mr. Waverly will be granted supervised visitation rights on alternate weekends, with the possibility of unsupervised visits pending successful completion of co-parenting education classes. Derek's head snapped up at the word supervised, the final humiliation in a day that had systematically destroyed every assumption he had made about his position in the world. The man who had entered the courtroom confident in his financial superiority was now being told he could not be trusted alone with his own daughters without professional oversight. Furthermore, Judge Holloway continued, given Mrs. Chin's demonstrated financial capacity and Mr. Waverly's previous testimony regarding appropriate support levels, the court finds that no child support payments will be required from Mr. Waverly to Mrs. Chun. However, Mr. Waverly will be responsible for transportation costs related to his visitation schedule. Maya rose from the witness stand with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the hearing, but now her calm composure seemed less like resignation and more like the confidence that came from holding an unassailable position. She approached Derek's table, where he sat staring at his hands, Margaret Steinberg having already begun gathering her papers with the efficient movements of someone eager to distance herself from a professional disaster. "Derek," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying none of the vindictiveness that might have been expected after years of dismissal and financial control, "I know this has been difficult for you. To help with the transportation costs for your visits with Sophie and Emma, I would like to offer you $500 per month. This should cover gas, parking, and any incidental expenses related to spending time with our daughters." The casual generosity of Maya's offer, delivered without spite or condescension, somehow made Derek's situation even more unbearable than outright mockery would have been. She was now offering him spending money with the same tone she might use to tip a helpful service worker. And the mathematical reality was that her monthly gift to him represented approximately 15 minutes of her investment income. Derek's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "The girls' college funds," he said, his words heavy with the realization that he could no longer provide advantages he had once taken for granted. "I had been planning to establish education savings accounts for them." Maya nodded respectfully, as though Derek had raised a practical concern rather than revealed his complete financial irrelevance. "I have already arranged for trust funds that will cover Sophie and Emma's complete educational expenses from kindergarten through doctoral degrees if they choose to pursue advanced studies. This includes private schools, tutoring, extracurricular activities, study abroad programs, and any educational opportunities that might interest them as they grow." She paused briefly before continuing, her tone remaining gentle despite the devastating scope of what she was describing. "The trust will also provide them with living allowances during their college years so they can focus on their studies rather than worrying about part-time employment." Each girl will have access to approximately $2 million specifically designated for educational purposes. Margaret Steinberg looked up from her frantic paper, shuffling to stare at Maya with something approaching professional awe. In her decades of practicing family law, she had never encountered anyone who could casually discuss multi-million-dollar educational trusts as though they were routine college savings plans. Derek made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his assumptions. "Maya," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and defeat, "WaveTech Solutions is still a viable company. We could discuss partnership opportunities or consulting arrangements that might benefit both of us." Maya's response was delivered with the kind of gentle finality that left no room for negotiation or future appeals. "Derek, I appreciate the offer, but I already own controlling interest in 3 technology companies that compete directly with WaveTech Solutions. If you find yourself in financial difficulty, I would be happy to discuss purchasing your remaining shares at fair market value. This might provide you with the liquidity to explore new career opportunities." Derek's remaining illusions shattered like glass hitting concrete as he realized that Maya had not just accumulated personal wealth, but had built a business empire that made his own company look like a neighborhood lemonade stand. She was not offering him partnership or consulting work because she had already moved far beyond his level of business operation. Judge Holloway concluded the hearing with standard instructions regarding custody transition procedures and compliance requirements. But Derek barely heard the details as they washed over him like background noise. Margaret gathered her materials and murmured something about billing arrangements that suggested his retainer would not cover the legal catastrophe they had just experienced. Maya approached the defense table where Thomas was organizing his papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose careful preparation had just paid off in spectacular fashion. "Thomas," she said quietly, "thank you for your exceptional representation today. I would like you to handle all future legal matters related to the girls' trust funds and educational planning. Your retainer will be transferred this afternoon." As Maya collected her simple purse and the tablet that had contained evidence of wealth beyond Derek's wildest imagination, she paused at the courtroom exit to speak with Judge Holloway's clerk about scheduling follow-up hearings related to the custody transition. Her movements were unhurried and purposeful, those of someone who no longer needed to worry about court schedules or legal fees or any of the practical constraints that governed other people's lives. Derek remained seated at the plaintiff's table, staring at the projection screen where Maya's Bitcoin holdings continued to update their real-time value as global cryptocurrency markets fluctuated through the afternoon. Margaret had already left the courtroom, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor as she retreated from what would undoubtedly become a cautionary tale shared in legal circles for years to come. The courtroom slowly emptied as spectators filed out, many of them whispering about what they had witnessed while others stood in small groups, trying to process the magnitude of Maya's financial revelation. Derek sat alone, surrounded by scattered legal documents and the electronic evidence of his complete misjudgment, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had been proved catastrophically wrong. Outside the courthouse, Maya paused on the steps to make a phone call to her wealth management team, scheduling an appointment to discuss the girls' educational trusts and her expanded investment portfolio. She spoke in the calm, measured tones of someone accustomed to making decisions involving enormous sums of money, her voice carrying clearly through the afternoon air as she arranged meetings that Derek could never have imagined during their marriage. Derek finally emerged from the courthouse 20 minutes later, his movements unsteady as he fumbled with his phone to call his attorney's office. The conversation was brief and one-sided, Margaret's assistant explaining that the firm would need to discuss Derek's account status before any additional legal services could be provided. As he walked toward his expensive car, Derek realized that even his legal representation was now uncertain, another casualty of his spectacular miscalculation. Maya drove away in her modest sedan, the same practical vehicle she had owned throughout their marriage, her wealth so secure that she felt no need for conspicuous displays of success. Behind her, Derek sat in his luxury car, making increasingly desperate phone calls to attorneys who seemed suddenly reluctant to take his calls once word spread through the legal community about the morning's proceedings. The irony was complete and devastating. Derek had spent years mocking Maya's interest in digital currency while building what he thought was impressive wealth through traditional business success. Now Maya's quiet perseverance with what he had dismissed as worthless computer money had made her wealthy beyond anything Derek could ever achieve, while his own financial position was revealed as essentially irrelevant to his daughter's future security. If you have ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated your knowledge or abilities, whether in your professional life or personal relationships, this story of patient preparation and ultimate vindication might resonate with your own experiences. Share in the comments below about a time when someone dismissed your interests or expertise, because sometimes the things others mock today become tomorrow's greatest advantages.